Okay, so I just shared a video that was talking about a guy that sued the cops and won. Alright? It's mentioning case Knoll versus Dial. So let's clarify a few things. First off, somebody going ahead and writing something on the sign, whatever they write on the sign, legally, that is First Amendment speech. Just like texting anything you want. Alright? Ultimately, if somebody ends up going ahead and getting offended by what you ended up texting, or they were offended by your language, ultimately that that's not a big deal. I mean, ultimately, unless it could go ahead and be translated as a threat, unless there's some reason for it to get vocalized. Like, for example, if you go ahead, like I've done for anger management, playing a D&D game, Dungeons and Dragons, and you go ahead and call out what attack you're going to do, you know, ultimately, that's not communicating a threat. All right? Not to mention that, but you have to go ahead and actually measure out the actual risk, what the communicated threat is, in comparison to the person's track record. All right? So when I've gone and called out, my attacks with Dungeons and Dragons, when I've gone and helped with coordination with a team playing game, whatever game it ends up being. Sometimes it could even be a shooter like Mech Attack, uh, Army of Two, you know. Unfortunately, I got to admit that from time to time I'll play Call of Duty. I personally feel that Call of Duty will never be as good as Army of Two, but that's personal taste. Anyway, to continue on, alright? If you're vocalizing something like that, ultimately you're strategizing coordination with a game, alright? I mean, ultimately, the factor that now that esports have become an Olympic event, competitive gaming, it's legitimate. So, that being said, when it comes to law enforcement, all right, if a cop ends up going ahead and knocking a sign out of your hand, that right there, that could be communicated as a threat. That could actually be considered assault. Because ultimately, trying to go ahead and use an object to go ahead and have that object go and hit somebody else. Transitively, that's them creating a weapon. Because anything could be a weapon. So, that being said, that sign hits the person's foot. Ultimately, that cop attacked that person. Alright? Now, cop going ahead and knocking the sign out of the hand because of being frustrated that the person won't talk. The person won't talk because of the factor that ultimately few things that usually ends up going ahead and get questioned first. First thing, talking to cops, not smart. Alright? Literally, the words just come out of the mouth. Lawyer. I want my lawyer. Whether you're guilty or you're innocent, that doesn't matter. Want my lawyer? I don't answer questions. Alright? That only ends up coming after the first set of questions. What should the first set of questions always be? Am I being detained? Alright? Like, for example, when I had a cop, when I was living over in Lenore, go ahead to drive past. I was walking to the grocery store. He ends up going ahead and seeing me on the way. He goes and tries to have a conversation. He is literally driving slowly with his window down while I'm walking on the sidewalk, which, by the way, sidewalk, public property. Goes and tries, having a conversation with me. I end up trying to at least be nice about it. And I ask the cop, I'm like, hey, officer, am I being detained? He said, no, I'm just, wondering why you're walking. How's it going today? I'm like, it's going okay today, officer. But, you know, if I'm not being detained, am I free to go? I was like, yeah. Now, ultimately, because of the fact of me asking first if I was being detained, he already knew that I knew my rights, so he didn't want to get into it. All right? But if the answer to am I being detained is yes, the next question that should be asked, what's your probable cause, officer? All right? Because ultimately, without probable cause of a crime either being in progress or being committed, that right there would be an illegal detainment. With that illegal detainment, if we were to go ahead and actually handcuff, throw you in the cop car, that right there would be an unlawful detainment. All right? Not to mention that, but if Miranda rights aren't read, ultimately, the lack of reading Miranda rights is so that way the person that's being detained, if they are being detained, do not understand what their rights are. All right? That perfect example on that one. When I had dealt with that whole situation of not even getting to go ahead and, say a single word to the judge, just literally chastised in front of an entire courtroom, and then, 6 months on a 120-day max. Ends up going and, I say to him, officer, since, you want to stop me and you're wanting to search, can we at least, so that way he knew that I wasn't trying to resist, I asked, can we at least go to this corner store where there's a camera right there? The reason why is so that way it'll make you safer and me safer. So that way you could know that I don't have any weapons on me. And ultimately, it would go ahead and have the camera catching the whole situation on tape. It'd make both of us safer. So he agreed to that. Didn't even go to, basically just started searching me regardless. Didn't tell me if I was detained or not. Didn't give me any reason. Just goes, puts me on the back trunk. Literally goes to put the handcuffs on me. And I literally asked during that situation, officer, aren't you going to read me don't you need to read me my Miranda rights? And his response is, what the fuck do you think this is, cops? Now understand, not only did he not read me my Miranda rights, I had clarified to him, you're gonna want, if you're gonna go ahead and try to arrest me, and book me, you're gonna want to read me my Miranda rights. He chose not to. All right? That's a deprivation of rights. Ultimately, that right there is a law enforcement tactic that had been deemed unconstitutional. Actually, it had gotten primarily used in New York. All right? It's called stop and frisk. All right? So, stop and frisk being unlawful and unconstitutional, due to the factor of not being detained, no crime being committed. Ultimately, that right there was a suppression of civil rights. So what I'm saying, know your rights, understand process. All right? And that expert, completely and utterly biased. All right? The factors that I'm mention also, by the way, if you start getting asked questions by law enforcement, say, I don't answer questions. I'll answer questions when my lawyer gets here. I want my lawyer. Because at least with your lawyer being there, your lawyer will be able to go ahead and keep a record of the interaction. And in that circumstance, it could even go ahead and be the difference between life and death.